7 senior Israeli military officers gone in a single strike. Not in an open battlefield, not in a convoy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, but inside what was supposed to be one of the safest places in the entire system, a fortified command center, reinforced, protected, and layered under some of the most advanced air defense architecture in the region. And yet, according to the source material, one Iranian missile still got through. Not Arrow, not THAAD, not Patriot. 10 interceptors were reportedly launched, and none of them stopped it. That is the kind of moment that forces every military planner in the region to stop and ask a much bigger question. Because if this account is accurate, then this was not just another missile strike in a crowded war. This was a direct hit on the idea that hardened command infrastructure can still guarantee survival in a high-end conflict. And that is where this story immediately becomes more than a headline. Because what allegedly struck that site was not presented as an ordinary ballistic missile. It was described as Iran's Fattah-2, a hypersonic system built around a maneuverable glide vehicle designed to move at extreme speed while changing course on the way in. In other words, a weapon built not just to hit hard, but to break the defensive logic that modern missile shields rely on. Now think about the symbolism of that for a moment. A command center exists to preserve control in the middle of chaos. It is the place a military depends on when everything else begins to move too fast. If that kind of location can be penetrated, if senior officers inside it can be killed in one strike, then the damage is not only operational, it is psychological. It reaches into confidence, deterrence, and the belief that your most protected nodes are still protected. So before we even get into the engineering, the speed, or the strategic fallout, one fact sits at the center of this story. If the source is right, this strike did not just kill commanders. It may have exposed a new weakness in the way this war is being fought. To understand why this strike matters, you first have to understand what made the weapon different. Most traditional ballistic missiles follow a path that defense systems are built to read. They launch, rise, arc, and descend. That predictability is exactly what lets radars track them and interceptors move into place. But the source describes the Fattah-2 as something more dangerous, a hypersonic system using a maneuverable glide vehicle rather than a standard re-entry body. And this is where the problem begins, because a glide vehicle does not simply fall toward its target on a fixed path. It can shift direction, alter its approach, and stay far less predictable while still moving at extreme speed. The source claims speeds in the Mach 13 to Mach 15 range, which would compress reaction time down to minutes across much of the region. That means defenders are not just racing against velocity, they are racing against uncertainty. In plain terms, this is the nightmare combination: speed plus maneuverability. That hybrid quality is what gives hypersonic weapons their strategic weight. They behave too unpredictably for older interception logic, but they move too fast for comfortable decision-making. And if that description is accurate, then the Fattah-2 was not just another missile used in this war. It was a weapon designed to break the defensive script itself. Now, this is where the story becomes genuinely alarming. The source does not just claim that the missile hit, it claims that 10 interceptors were launched and all of them failed. If that account is accurate, then the issue was not a lack of warning or a total absence of defense. The issue was that the defense was there, it reacted, and it still could not stop the weapon coming in. And that is a very different kind of message, because modern air defense is built around probability. No system is marketed as magic. But layered defenses are supposed to create multiple chances to defeat an incoming threat before it reaches a critical target. So when a strike still gets through, despite several attempts to stop it, military planners do not just see one successful hit, they see a problem with the model itself. The source's explanation is simple. The missile's speed and maneuverability may have overwhelmed the engagement logic defenders depend on. A target that changes course at hypersonic speed becomes far harder to predict, and prediction is everything in interception. That means this was not just a tactical failure, it was a warning. Because once a weapon can repeatedly compress reaction time and disrupt tracking logic, even the most expensive defensive shield starts to look less like protection and more like a gamble. But that is where this story becomes bigger than one missile and one strike. For decades, the logic behind hardened command centers has been straightforward. In a major war, leadership must survive long enough to keep forces coordinated, maintain communications, and preserve decision-making under pressure. That is why militaries bury command infrastructure, reinforce it, and wrap it in layers of air defense. The idea is not that these sites are invulnerable, but that they are survivable. The source argues that this assumption may now be under serious pressure. Because if a maneuverable hypersonic weapon can penetrate defenses and hit a fortified command site with high precision, then the problem is no longer just about damage. It is about trust in the system. A command center only works as a last line of stability if the people inside believe it can still protect them. Once that confidence starts to weaken, the strategic effect spreads well beyond the blast zone. And this is why the alleged deaths of senior officers matter so much in the narrative. The strike was not aimed at a random structure. It was framed as a hit on the very architecture of control. If that framing is accurate, then the message was brutally clear. Even the places built to endure may no longer be secure. The next layer of this story is not just military, it is political. According to the source, this was the first known combat use of the Fattah-2. That matters, because first use is never just about performance, it is about messaging. A country does not unveil a weapon like this in live war conditions unless it wants more than battlefield damage. It wants to send a signal to its enemies, to its own public, and to every outside power watching the region. And the signal here was hard to miss. The source frames the strike as part of a broader Iranian response during a rapidly widening conflict involving Israel, the United States, and regional military sites. In that context, using the weapon against high-value targets turns the debut into a strategic announcement. Iran was not simply saying it could retaliate, it was saying it could retaliate in a way existing defenses might not stop. That changes the meaning of the strike, because once a new weapon enters combat successfully, the conversation immediately shifts from theory to planning. Militaries no longer ask whether the system works in principle, they ask how many exist, where they are deployed, and what can be done before the next launch. And that is why this chapter matters. The debut was not only destructive, it was a declaration that a new layer of danger had entered the war. And this is where the pressure starts to widen. If the source is correct that this kind of missile is extremely difficult to intercept once airborne, then the strategic problem changes immediately. Defense is no longer only about stopping the weapon in the sky. It becomes about finding and destroying the launcher before it ever fires. That may sound like a technical adjustment, but in practice, it points toward a much more dangerous phase of war. Because pre-launch destruction requires deeper intelligence, faster targeting, and potentially wider offensive operations. In other words, if your shield cannot be trusted, you start leaning harder on the sword. That matters because it increases the incentive to strike mobile launchers, storage sites, command nodes, and support infrastructure inside Iranian territory or across the wider battle space. And once that happens, the conflict is no longer being managed only through interception and retaliation. It starts moving toward a more aggressive cycle of hunt, strike, and counterstrike. The source also places this strike inside a broader regional picture involving Gulf bases, airspace disruption, and rising tension around critical waterways. That wider context is essential. One missile alone is serious. One missile inside an already expanding confrontation is something else entirely. Because once offensive pressure becomes the only reliable answer, escalation stops being a risk on the horizon. It becomes the logic of the war itself. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. If the source is even broadly accurate, this is no longer just an Israel-Iran battlefield story. It becomes part of a much larger global warning about where missile warfare is heading. For years, hypersonic weapons have been discussed as the next major challenge in military technology. Russia, China, and North Korea have all been linked to hypersonic development in different ways. What makes this case different is the sources claim that Iran has now brought that challenge into active regional combat, and that is what gives this moment its wider significance. Because air defense has been one of the central assumptions behind modern military planning, states spend billions on radar coverage, interceptor networks, and layered shields because those systems are supposed to buy time, reduce damage, and preserve strategic stability. But if more countries can field weapons that are both extremely fast and hard to predict, then that assumption starts to weaken. The source pushes exactly that argument. This is not just about one missile getting through. It is about what that says to every military watching from a distance. If a sanctioned regional power can allegedly deploy this kind of capability under wartime pressure, then the implications go far beyond the Middle East. It suggests the offense-defense balance may be shifting faster than many governments were prepared to admit. So where does all of this leave us? If the source's account is accurate, then this was not just a successful strike. It was a strategic shock. 7 senior officers allegedly killed inside a fortified command center, multiple interceptors reportedly failing, and a hypersonic weapon making its combat debut in the middle of a widening regional confrontation. That combination turns one attack into something much larger than a battlefield incident. It becomes a warning about vulnerability, because the deeper issue here is not only whether one side landed a devastating hit, it is whether the assumptions behind survivability, deterrence, and air defense are starting to crack under new technological pressure. Once that question enters a war like this, every layer of planning changes. Command centers look different. Regional bases look different. Missile defense promises look different. Even political decision-making begins to shift when leaders know that reaction time may be measured in minutes and that protection may be far less reliable than advertised. And that is why this story carries weight far beyond the site that was struck. The answers are still uncertain. The battlefield picture is still developing. But if this source is right about what happened, then militaries across the region and beyond are already being forced to confront a brutal possibility. The old defensive script may no longer be enough.